when sometimes people want to interview me and they want to go chronologically, starting at the very beginning of my career, well, an hour goes by and we're only in 1985, so it's not the way to go, because there's just so much stuff. So it's always easier to jump around and hit the high points.
And there's just so much variety
Yeah,
in
for
your
sure.
work too. Like you've worked on so many different characters over the years. You're definitely not somebody that's really focused just on one character.
Or one genre, yeah, or
Yeah.
one medium. Yeah, I've really tried over the years to keep it diverse for my own sanity. I've always said if all I ever did was just superhero comics and nothing else and didn't do creator-owned stuff and didn't do, TV and film or novels, my brain might have exploded and I might have been done with this stuff years ago. So by keeping it diverse, it's allowed me to keep going all these years and also keep challenging myself. I tend to write from the characters out, not from the plot in. If you don't have deep, interesting characters to follow on that journey, no one's going to be interested, no matter how. Like, I've never been a fan of like what they call puzzle stories where it's all plot and you just have to, you want to put the pieces of the puzzle together. It's great to have a great puzzle, but I want to get involved with the characters. I'm interested in what's going on inside their heads, inside their hearts. That's what makes a story interesting to me. And I think that even on the days when I really suck, and we all suck on some days, there are just some days it's not working and the story is not working. I'm at least attempting to get into the heads and the hearts of these characters.
I think that's an important part. Like understanding the psychology of the characters is why your work is so like pivotal for characters like Spider-Man and stuff. And like, we'll kind of get into it later, but like Kraven's Last Hunt is very much to me a story about mental health and like being mentally unwell. And it's just such an interesting direction to take superhero stories because I feel like they had touched on mental health, but Kraven's Last Hunt is one of the first ones I can think of that like takes it on so directly. And you just were not afraid to show the ugliness of going through what Kraven was going through.
The first mistake one could make is kind of think, I'm going to write a story about mental health or the psychological breakdown. All I'm doing is following the characters. So I get presented with Kraven. The story originally didn't have Kraven in it. And I kind of stumbled across, I had created a completely new villain for that story. And then one day, this was before the internet, so if a writer needed to waste time and avoid work, you had to do other things and waste time on the internet. And I was flipping through the Marvel Handbook, remember the Handbook of the Marvel Universe? So I came across the entry for Kraven, and it mentioned that Kraven was Russian. One of my all-time favorite writers is Dostoevsky, and that whole sort of the duality of the human soul and this sort of emotionality of the Russian soul. And I went, oh, I understand this guy. Character that I was never interested in any way, shape, or form until that point. And suddenly I went, I'm throwing out this new villain that I created, and I'm bringing Kraven in. And then it was like it becomes, you kind of become a therapist in a way. You start peeling back the psyche of these characters and trying to understand them, but not in a way that again, I think anytime you're trying to make a big, bold statement in a story, you're going to shoot yourself in the foot. You just want to follow the characters and you want to follow the story. And then the statements kind of emerge on their own, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. And as a reader, I love when you could see the writer's process as you're reading it. And you're one of those writers that for sure, like as a reader, you could tell where your mind is going. So we just kind of wanted to talk about some of your works that we're fans of and ask some questions.
Sure.
Starting off with Justice League International, which I'm a huge fan of. Love it so much. Such like a fun comic. It really is shows, going from Kraven's Last Hunt to Justice League International, like you see the diversity in your work.
And
But
I
uh,
realized years later that I was working on both those things at one point simultaneously. So imagine what's
wow,
going on in my head.
yeah, to be able to switch between those two is impressive.
But the
Um,
link between the two is Justice League had a lot of humor in it, but we took our characters seriously. They were
yes,
human beings that had a great sense of humor. So that's where the humor came from. Occasionally we pushed it to the edge, yeah. But mostly it was character-based humor that I always say just reminded me of me and my friends, on a Saturday night growing up in Brooklyn, sitting around, goofing around with each other. And sometimes in life, the more serious the situation gets, the more we use humor to get through it. So in a lot of ways, I often thought those characters were more real than the very, very serious characters that we see in comics, because that's really the way most of us are. We joke with each other, and we use humor to get through tough situations.
It's great because they almost just feel like a band of like coworkers. Like it feels like they're
Yes.
having fun, they're working together, they're hanging out. Like, and I think there's been a lot of like stuff with superheroes since then that have gone in that direction of like bringing them down to earth, making them seem more human. But like, I always think of Justice League International as one of the big things that humanize superheroes for a lot of people. You and Keith Griffin were working with a diverse group of superheroes there. How did you kind of develop the chemistry between them?
Well, first of all, the group of characters that we started with, we added more obviously along the way, were just presented to us. They had just done some big crossover. I think it was Legends or one of those massive intercompany crossovers. And they said, okay, here's your new team. Here's your new Justice League. So we didn't go, oh, do I get to use this? Do I get to use that? I know Kevin McGuire, our artist, took the gig because he thought he was going to be doing Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, the classic guys. And then he got there and he discovered we got this bunch of second stringers for the most part, aside from Batman. But that was a gift. When I started at Marvel, I did a book called The Defenders for like 3 years when I first started there. And I used all B and C and D list characters because no one's looking over your shoulder. No one's telling you, you can't do that with the Son of Satan or Nighthawk or Devil Slayer or Hellcat or whatever, because they don't care. If you have the big guns, you have 20 editors looking over your shoulders telling you what you can and can't do. So really getting those characters, when I say B and C list, I don't mean that they're not good characters. I just mean that they were not considered the marquee characters. So that gave us the freedom to make them our own, and we really, really did. I look at those versions of those characters as very distinct from any other versions before or after. So it was the same process. Nobody sat down, me, Keith, Andy Helfer, our editor, and said, we're going to do a comedy-centric superhero book. That wasn't the plan. Everyone thinks that was what we set out to do. It just kind of happened. And it happened, because, Keith did the plots and I would do the scripting. And Keith was a hilarious human being. Keith always brought a sense of humor to whatever he did. And so to have that humor there in the plots invited me to kind of unleash that part of my personality as well, which maybe didn't come out as much in other things I'd written. But more than that, it allowed us to follow these characters. And so, people say, you talk about Blue Beetle and Booster Gold, and, did you plan to make them this team, a buddy? No, Keith threw them in a scene together. I got them talking to each other. And just the way two human beings in the real world meet and have chemistry, these characters on the page met and had chemistry. And they were the ones that said, hey, you know what? We're going to be friends. We're going to be a big part of this book as a team. We didn't set out to do that. It just happened. And as a writer, that's what you hope for any story. If I'm surprised by my story, then I know I'm onto something good. I always have a map when I start out. I like to say there are tent poles, and I set them out, and I always hope that those tent poles will collapse at some point because you think you're going that way, but really the story needs to go in an opposite direction. And then the story or the characters, they rear up. I've had characters literally on the page just start saying things that I didn't expect, that I didn't plan. And then I know I'm onto something good because I'm not in control. The characters are in control. The story's in control. Maybe my unconscious mind is in control. But my conscious mind is like, whoa, what's happening here? And that's really the fun of it.
You have such a way of creating like voices for these characters and giving them their own distinct personalities that feel real. What character in the Justice League International, which one of their voices came easiest to you?
That's a great question. I don't know about which voice came easiest, but the characters that I think I related to the most were Blue Beetle. At least the way that we wrote Blue Beetle I felt like I put a lot of myself into Blue Beetle. And at the opposite end of the spectrum, because he's an alien, was the Martian Manhunter. Loved that character, loved writing that character. Very, very easy. Understood him, at least our version, right away. So, but I loved them all, really, because what you discover as you go along, every character that you write is some aspect of who you are. You're filtering different aspects of your personality through these characters. To go back to Kraven's Last Hunt, there was something in Peter, something in Kraven, even something in Vermin that was reflecting some aspect of myself. Obviously, in a distorted, melodramatic way, but they all come from inside us. And the fun of it is, that we're pouring ourselves into these characters, and yet these characters take on individual lives of their own. So there's this wedding of the writer's psyche and the character themselves. It's this fascinating union, and then it becomes its own thing. I could sit down and create a character from scratch and thinking it's completely autobiographical, but by the time that character hits the page, it takes on a life of its own. And it's, even though it's a part of me, it's separate from me.
You talk about how, working with characters that are less popular, kind of allows you to have this free flow of ideas where you kind of bounce one idea off of another character and you kind of build them and develop them into like a new identity almost. Would you say when you write something like Kraven's Last Hunt, which is like Spider-Man, Marvel's Golden Boy, do you think that becomes a little more restrictive when it comes to like editors and people breathing down your neck kind of thing?
It can be. It depends on the book. It depends on the editor. A story like Kraven's Last Hunt, my work on Spectacular Spider-Man with Sal Buscema, which finally just got collected last summer after I don't know how many decades. I had so much freedom to tell those stories in exactly the way that I wanted to tell them. My editors were great. They were there to backstop me if I was screwing up somewhere, but they gave me the freedom to tell those stories very much in my own way with my own voice. And even there's Spider-Man. There's a character that had been around for decades before I ever came to that character. And yet every writer that comes to Peter Parker deposits a part of themselves into that character, And then the next person does, and the next person. If you're given the freedom, and sometimes you're not, sometimes you do feel very restricted by some editorial policy or a particular editor who's hovering over your shoulder, which is the worst feeling in the world. Once you feel an editor like hovering over your shoulder, looking at everything you're doing, I find, for me personally, it freezes you up after a certain point, and you can't create because everything you write, you're thinking, what's their reaction going to be to this line or this scene or whatever. But that's only happened to me rarely over the years. I've had a lot of freedom. And so a character like even Peter Parker, I've written Peter Parker probably more than any other character in all of comics that I've written. And I've written a lot of them in comics and in animation. And it becomes a very intimate relationship. I've said before that I know Peter better than I know some of my best friends. When I'm writing Peter Parker, I know everything in his head. I know every fear. I know all his aspirations. I know all his dreams. I know all his stupidity and his idiocy. I know his courage. I know his fear. I know everything. Then whenever I come back to the character, and it seems like I'm always coming back to the character, I have a bunch of several Spider-Man related things coming out this summer and into September. It's like a reunion with an old friend because I know him that well. So again, I've poured my own heart and soul into Peter. I could look at things in Spider-Man stories that autobiographical as what I put into Brooklyn Dreams, which was an autobiographical graphic novel that I did. The readers don't know that it's autobiographical. They think they're just reading about Peter's life. But words come out of his mouth and thoughts are in his head that are sometimes my most intimate thoughts and feelings, And even with the Justice League characters, for all their goofiness, there are things that Blue Beetle might have thought and felt and said. That was from the depths of me. So you have to pour your heart and soul into all these characters. And if you're allowed the freedom, like I said, it becomes a mind meld between you and the character. You have your individuality, they have theirs, and yet something gets created in the middle between the two of you.
So I like how with Justice League International, like how all these characters, like, obscure, like as you're saying, D-list characters, right? And you give them depth with like, tapping into their intimacies and like, as you were saying with like Peter Parker, their dreams, fears, aspirations. That series laid the groundwork for Justice League Unlimited and even for James Gunn's, new DC universe, taking these characters and making something more of them, because I feel like that run, shaped my love for characters like the Martian Manhunter, like Mr. Miracle, Maxwell Lord as well. It really just tackles upon a lot, and like, you get these characters and you're like, okay, like, oh, well, where can I find more about, Mr. Miracle or, Martian Manhunter? Then it opens up like doors to like, okay, the new gods,
Right.
and then, the Martians, and so I really like love that with the run, like how it takes and commingles all these characters from different walks of life in the DC universe and makes them more.
Yeah, thanks. And you can always do that. It doesn't matter how obscure the character, or for that matter, the other end of the spectrum. If you're writing Superman, Batman, Captain America, Spider-Man, the goal is to bring something fresh to the table. You hope sometimes, we're human. Sometimes we can't do it. But for the most part, And I've said this a million times before, but I'll say it to you guys for the first time. I always say you have to cut off the top of the heads of these characters, get out a flashlight and root around inside and find some aspect that hasn't been explored before. I did a series, a Spider-Man miniseries, I guess it was 2 years ago, called Shadow of the Green Goblin. And it took place like 2 weeks after Uncle Ben's death. He's just brand new to being Spider-Man. And it was an era of Spider-Man I'd only explored a little bit. And Norman Osborn's in there, and Harry's in there, and Gwen is in there at a point in time before we really got to know any of them. So it allowed me to open the door and look at these characters in different ways and explore their relationships in different ways and their psychology in different ways. If you work it, even with the character that's been around for 80 years, you can always find something new to say. And there's so many different ways to interpret these characters too, you know? I've worked on so many different versions of Batman. You know, the Batman in our JLI, you knew that even though he was playing it straight, he was delighted with these idiots. Do you know what I mean? He wouldn't allow himself to smile, but he was smiling. He was smiling, or else he wouldn't have stuck around. And then I've written the very serious Batman, you know, the grim, just dark, awful Batman. And then I've written the Batman who's really much more forward-facing and heroic. And I wrote for the Batman, the Brave and the Bold, a TV show, which was sort of like the campy 1960s Batman. And now I'm writing for Cape Crusader. The second season's coming on at the end of July. I've got an episode coming up there. And that's like a 1940s film noir version of Batman. And it's a very different take on Batman. I had to really adjust my thinking writing for that show. These characters are so open to interpretation that if you put your mind to it, you can always find something new to say and something new to do with them.
So, like your Captain America run, I feel like especially within the 80s and 90s time with a lot of things that's going around and going on socially and politically, like I feel like this run like strips Cap, like you really go and see his like morality and like, you know, him as like a person, which is like, you know, you saying like, you know, you're carving and looking inside of like, you know, the brains of these characters to find out, hey, what can I pull? And like I feel like, is there any parts of like Steve Rogers' humanity that you want the readers to connect with?
Yeah, I know it's kind of the same thing I was saying, that you have to, no matter who the character is. You know, it's very easy with Captain America to, it's Captain America. You know, it's not a human being. He's just a symbol. And there always has to be a human being behind that symbol. You know, Roger Stern and John Byrne had built a beautiful framework that I built upon during those 3.5 years that I wrote that book. And it's an interesting thing also as a writer. Sometimes, you know, you're a fan of a character and you get to write them and it's fantastic. Sometimes you're a fan of a character and you write them and you realize you're not quite connecting with them and you'd much rather be reading about them than writing them. And sometimes, you know, you like a character, but you're not a big fan. I read Captain America for years. I especially loved Steve Englehart's incredible run on that book. And of course, anything Jack Kirby did. But I would never have said, oh, Captain America is my favorite character. And then you start to write the character and you get to know them. Again, you begin to peel it back. And you had to have, you know, Steve Rogers, to me, is like, I don't know, if you go back to like 1940s movies, it's like Jimmy Stewart, you know, the decent man, you know, the guy who's always going to do the right thing. It may not always be easy, but he will always do the right thing. But he's also human. He's also flawed. He also has to make mistakes. And Stern and Byrne had given him a nice supporting cast, you know, so that's something that's gotten lost, I think, over the years, to have like a rich supporting cast of just real people around the main superhero character, so you can see their humanity. I loved his relationship with his girlfriend, Bernie Rosenthal. I brought in his childhood best friend, Arnie Roth, who was one of the first, if not the first, openly gay character in Marvel Comics. I brought back the Bucky of the 50s. There was a whole wonderful thing to explore there. But all of it, you know, to ground Steve in his humanity. At the same time, I always say the essence of a great Captain America story is, as Captain America, he represents the American dream. And as we all know, now more than ever, there's a big gap between the American dream and the American reality. And that space in between is where a great Captain America story lies. You know, let's explore that gap between the dream and the reality. You know, people that try to make Captain America into a political symbol in terms of like, he's aligned with one party or what another. No, he's aligned with the dream of the best of what America can be, you know? He's not someone who would deny America's flaws and try to erase that. He's well aware of it. That gap between the dream and the reality, to me, is where a good story lies with that character.
Captain America, like that, his name in essence ties him to the United States of America. As you may be aware, there are some current ongoing
Yes.
situations with the United
Well, this
States
is what I
of
was just saying.
America.
There's a big gap between the dream and the reality.
No,
And I don't know if it's ever
exactly.
been
And
bigger.
so, how do you think someone would write a modern day Captain America story in the year 2026? Do you think that they can escape all of that and kind of keep it tied to like a foundational, like, just like standard Captain America story? Maybe you, I don't know, fight the KGB again,
Right,
or do you
right.
have to rest or an elephant in the
I
room?
think in some way, shape, or form, and maybe you don't have to hit the readers over the head with it, but yeah, you have to address that. You have to address what's going. When I was writing it, this is in the early 80s, before you guys were born, clearly, it was the Reagan era. And a lot of the same things that are going on now were going on then, not quite in as overt a way, but it was all there bubbling away under the surface. And we dealt with those issues. I don't think you could, if you're writing a book called Captain America, you can't ignore that stuff. But you also, Steve Rogers' point of view is always the compassionate point of view. He's the guy, it's sort of like Superman in a way. He sees the best in everyone and in every situation. So he will always try to find the middle ground with whoever it is, even as he opposes whatever that thing may be. I don't think you can write Captain America today and ignore what's happening in our country because, like you said, that's the name of the character. It's America. It's right there. You have to face it and you have to deal with it in some form without belaboring it, without slamming the readers over the head. But whenever you see people saying, these stories shouldn't be political, Captain America, go back to my run, go back to Englehart's run. They're not meant to be political in the sense of taking a side necessarily, but you're dealing with the realities of our country. If you call that political, then it's political. Go back to the very first story. He's punching Adolf Hitler in the face. That's political.
I like how your run really strips Steve of like the serum, the shield, the suit. Like you just see like the man, right? And I feel that you talked about this before, and I love that you elaborate on this, Chris. Like he's caught between like loyalty, like to his country, loyalty to his conscience, like who like Steve Rogers is. But as you were saying, like he's just the dream, like no political sides or alignments. He's just the dream and what America represents at its best. I was fascinated about that tension because I feel that like at least when he's depicted in X-Men stories, you feel like he's like America. Oh, well, if I, go to this country, like it'll represent America the wrong way or whatnot.
Yeah. And when he represents the dream, I think in Steve's mind, that dream is a dream for everyone. It's not a narrow dream that only allows certain people in. He wouldn't think of that politically. But the thing that I realized, and I think it was unconscious at first, but if you look at the book in that era, first of all, his best friend was a black guy. His girlfriend was Jewish. Then we brought in Arnie Roth, who was a gay man. It's everyone. I brought in a character called Black Crow, who represented the whole Native American take on what America is, which is very different than that, and it brought them to butt heads. And so you want to represent that whole thing because there are people out there clearly today who think America is only a specific thing for specific people, and Steve Rogers would vehemently disagree with that, and he would not think that's a political statement. He would think that's the essence and the truth of what America is.
And I always feel like when I tell people that, they always give you a little bit of a look, especially if they're not like into the comics as much.
If they don't know the character, yeah.
Yeah, they're like, oh, with everything going on, that guy's your favorite superhero. He's never political, but he's always fighting against whatever injustices are going on in the country. He's always meant to go be for the people and not for the government. So very well said. And yeah, very, very interesting take on Captain America. And I feel like he's not like Superman, but especially in your run, I can see some Superman like optimism and kind of like
and the basic
traits coming
decency.
through.
Both of them, Superman's superpower is not his powers; it's his basic decency, and his belief in the best of all of us, and that's what he shares. I don't know, have they ever done a Captain America Superman team up?
Yes, I think
They
so.
have?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. They might be unbearable together, these two guys who just believe in the best in everyone, right? You need to stick Batman in the middle, for a little cynicism,
It's
right?
the two nicest guys you've ever met ever,
Right,
hanging out.
right. Yeah, exactly. I wonder if they would
If
irritate each other or if they'd get along really well. It'd be very funny to
if
just
if
have a whole book that's just a conversation between Steve Rogers and Clark Kent sitting around together.
Be dope.
this is just a random question to throw out there. If you could do one between two characters, which one would you want to write?
Oh, that's a good question. Until this moment, I never thought of it. I'd love to do Captain America and Superman now.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
That would be great. I
That'd be
also,
very
I'm a big
timeless.
fan of the supernatural characters because I think you can sort of go off into these metaphysical spaces and psychological spaces in a way that you can't in a straight ahead superhero book, certainly in all the spiritual metaphysical spaces. So I'd like to see like Doctor Strange and Doctor Fate. I've written both those characters, put them together in a nice big cosmic supernatural adventure would be a lot of fun. A lot of fun.
Yeah, Dr. Fate is such an interesting character. Your run on him is very, very, very good
That
as
was
well. I
another one where I
love
was so delighted that they finally, after decades, put out the collection last year that I've been waiting for so many years. Really great. Really happy with that.
Yeah, even like it's crazy how the publishers sometimes I don't know, they struggle with having stuff in print because I remember for the longest time Craven's Last Hunt, which is so well known, so well regarded, like I couldn't find it in any stores for some reason. Marvel,
Really?
like, yeah, there was an issue, I think it was like around 2020, 2021, where they had an issue with the Marvel warehouse and a bunch of
Oh,
like
okay.
their most like popular stories were out of print. It's crazy to me that some of these stories are not just constantly in print and how
Right.
classic
Well,
they are.
although I have to say, I mean, maybe there was a problem there, but Craven, for the most part, every year or two, there's a new edition and there's a new edition. And
Yes.
I
I'm
mean,
very grateful because
you can't walk
go ahead, go ahead.
you can't walk into a comic book store now just without seeing like lines and lines of Craven's Last Hunt
And when
prints.
we
Like
worked on
just
this stuff, books being collected was like really kind of a new thing. And when they did the first hardcover collection of Craven, it was a big deal. In those days, you're working on a book, you're done with it, you don't think you're ever going to see it again, let alone sitting here, at 40 years later, and the book is still in print. And as a freelancer, I'm very grateful because those books generate royalties. So that's continued to bring in money year after year, and it's nothing to sneeze at.
Hey, I mean, you should pat yourself on the back. You wrote a banger.
And the truth is,
Oh yeah.
I've said this before, you
I mean,
don't
look,
know.
look
You
at my
have,
shirt.
oh, okay, that's great.
Yeah.
I'm not wearing right now, but because I'm repping my country today. But I have a shirt. Me and John have the
Yeah, we have
same
the same
shirt
shirt.
of Craven, wearing the black suit, crawling on the wall.
And my
That's
favorite
great.
thing to point out to people is they like, oh, that's such a cool shirt of Spider-Man. I'm like, oh, it's not Spider-Man, it's
It's like
Craven.
not a Spider-Man shirt. It's the
It's
Craven
Craven
shirt.
wearing the suit.
So I'm fascinated by the fact that you guys who weren't alive when this story came out, or Captain America, or even probably JLI, how do you discover this stuff? And that's one of the things I really enjoy about this is they keep makes it through the reprints, I guess, because I'll go to conventions and I'll see guys your age or even younger saying, I just read this last week for the first time. And it's really gratifying because some people, they just want to read the new stuff. They don't want to look back. So what led you guys back?
Raven's Last Hunt is a story that I have to be honest with you, has always been in the like talking of like the best Spider-Man story. So as soon as I got into comics and I wanted to start reading Spider-Man, I was just told Craven's Last Hunt, Craven's Last Hunt. And I'm a Batman fan. I'm a huge, huge Batman fan. And I didn't get into Marvel until a little bit later in my like comic reading, career. Somebody told me that Craven's Last Hunt almost feels a little bit like a Batman story.
It
In
almost
that it's
was a
very
Batman story. Yeah.
wow, yeah, yeah. I could see that because it's very dark and the imagery of it, like seeing the like Spider-Man crawling out of the grave like this and like the art in it was a big thing for me. And then reading it and like it's such a like great story and the writing, it's one of the I think that comic writing has shifted a lot and changed a lot. But going back and reading older stuff, you really get to see like it's it was an it was an era of like change you could tell in the industry and I love to look back on the 80s and 90s because it's such like a pivotal era for comics. People talk about the 60s and stuff a lot and 50s, whatever. I just love the 80s and 90s and Craven's Last Hunt is awesome. And JLI is awesome, and you really created a lot of great stuff during that time.
Thank you. You know,
I mean,
go ahead.
I was gonna say the same thing, you know, like I've been a Spider-Man fan my whole life, but you know, I grew up on like the cartoons and then the movies, and then finally later on in my life, you know, I started reading more comic books. And when I first started reading, you know, I was like, where's the Spider-Man stories? Give me all the Spider-Man stuff. And everyone would always be like, oh, you gotta check out Craven's Last Hunt, you gotta check out Spider-Man Blue, you gotta check out Death of Gwen Stacy, and all those are like the big three that I hear all the time. Like, oh, and Ultimate Spider-Man, I guess, as well is another one. But Craven's Last Hunt was like the first one that I actually bought physically. And then it was Spider-Man Blue.
You also don't
And
need
you-
to know a ton about Spider-Man to read Craven's Last Hunt and enjoy it.
Yeah, it helps to have a story that can kind of be contained on its own, because one of the problems with
Yeah.
comics is that they're always so convoluted and tied into 100 million years of continuity.
Yeah.
But what I was going to say before is, you know, when you're creating something, you have no idea whether that story is going to be successful or sink like a stone. You know, someone once said to me, well, did you know when you were writing Craven or some other story that you were writing a classic that would be reprinted for years? Of course not. You know, you'd be an absolute idiot to sit down and write and think, oh, I'm writing a classic that will be remembered for many years. You know, you're just hoping you can write a coherent story with some depth to it. That's all you're hoping. You know, what I've seen over the years is sometimes stories that I've written that I think are much better than Craven's Last Hunt, you know, people don't connect with. Or it may take them 10 or 15 years. You know, you guys are asking me about Captain America. When that book was coming out, it sold okay, but it wasn't like people didn't respond to it in a big way. Years passed, and I go to conventions, and suddenly there are all these people that are clicking with that Captain America run years after I wrote it, you know? So you never know. I always say, once I sail the story out into the world, it's out of my hands, and it's between the story and the audience. And they have a chemistry that's different between my chemistry with the story. So like I said, sometimes there are stories that I think, God, this is the best damn thing I've ever written. And everybody just shrugs. Then you write another story, they think, oh, that was okay. And people go bananas for it. So you have no control over that. It's an interesting process.
I think you're also touching a lot on the nature of art. I mean, like Vincent van Gogh never saw a cent for any of his paintings, and he's still revered as one of the greatest to ever
He
live.
thought he was a
And
failure.
so, like, exactly, like he died thinking he was a failure. He saw no money from his art, and now his paintings are, you know, hung in the Louvre now.
Yeah.
I think a lot of art pieces kind of evolve this way, where like they take on a shape of their own, and you
Yes.
know, you kind of write something on a whim. You think maybe it'll do well, and then you know, years down the line, it comes right back at you, and you're like, oh, you remember this thing you wrote 30 years ago?
Yeah.
Well, actually, I really like that thing.
I'm always amazed because that's one of the reasons why I've learned over the years never to knock my own work publicly. Because the story that I may be really dissatisfied with might be someone else's favorite story. You know, and sometimes people come up and they, I love this story. I think it's this, it's that. And in my head, I'm going, really? You do? I hated that story, you know? But again, once I release that story, it's between you and the story. It helps me to reappreciate, because sometimes, especially if I look back at my early work, you know, you keep growing as the years go by. So when you look back at early work, I see the flaws so clearly. Oh, that line was so clunky, or the plotting was off, or, you know, whatever it was. And so someone else comes to me with that story, and I can see it with fresh eyes and realize, you know, beyond whatever flaws I may see, hey, that was pretty good work after all, you know? Because one thing I know is on my best day or my worst day, I'm trying my best to do a good story. I may not succeed on that particular day. The story just might die. Or again, I might think it's dead and you might think it's brilliant. Or I might think it's brilliant and you might think it's awful. You never know. So all I can do is do the very best and then sail it out into the world and see what happens.
What is something that you feel very close to that you feel like not enough people talk about?
It's a lot of my creator-owned work for sure, but I was going to pick two. I did an autobiographical graphic novel called Brooklyn Dreams, which originally did it for Paradox Press, then Vertigo reprinted it, then IDW did it a few years ago, and then this past year, Dark Horse did a beautiful new edition of the book. And that, one of the very, very best things I've ever done. Obviously, it's autobiographical, so it's very close to my heart. Amazing art by Glenn Barr. And the other one, which although this is another one that's been printed and reprinted over the years, but not everyone knows about it, is Moonshadow, which was the first major creator-owned project that I did for Marvel's Epic Comics back in the 80s. Then we took it to Vertigo in the 90s, did a sequel called Farewell Moonshadow. They collected all that together. And then last year, again, Dark Horse put out a beautiful, beautiful edition of that. So those are probably the two. The thing is, with my work, there are a lot of people that are just into the stuff I did with Giffen. That's how they know me, through, JLI and the funny stuff. There's the people that just know my straight ahead superhero stuff or the Spider-Man stuff or whatever. There's a whole other group of people that just know my creator-owned stuff and may know Moonshadow, would never read a Spider-Man story. And as I discovered working in animation, there's a whole group of people that know these characters just through animation and would never pick up a comic book. They just love those characters in the animated TV shows and the animated movies. And my work has been pretty diverse, so you can't really mix up a Spider-Man story with Moonshadow, even though thematically, if you dig deep, you'll find themes that recur through all of them. But you're working with a specific genre, so the flavor is very different. I did a Kickstarter thing. We've done 2 rounds of it so far over the past, say, 4 years, called the DeMatteis, where I launched 5 new series. Each one was in a different genre, a different style, with a different artist. And that was really satisfying for me because, oh, well, this is sort of a superhero story. This is a supernatural Western. This is a fantasy about the afterlife. I always strive to find a different genre, a different tone, something else to express myself in, so I can keep myself interested, really. Because if I lose interest, then forget it, then it's over. So as a writer, you start to write the end of that story. And then turns out they do something completely different. And I'm thinking in my head, I like my version better. So you sort of take that and you begin to build it into a completely different story that has nothing to do with the original source, So ideas come and inspiration comes in so many different ways. One of my favorite writers is Ray Bradbury. And whenever I read Bradbury, I'm always inspired to sit down and write, not necessarily to echo what he did in his stories, but there's something in his style, in his energy, that gives me that energy, to the creative energy to sit down and write.
What's your favorite Ray Bradbury book?
That's a good question.
Oh, there's so many good ones. Dandelion Wine is my favorite. If you guys haven't read that, I would highly recommend it. And what's great about Dandelion Wine is it's not fantasy or science fiction. It's basically him looking back at his childhood growing up in the Midwest. But because it's Bradbury, he looks at the real world with the eyes of the fantastic. So it feels like a fantasy novel, even though it's about, quote, real life. And I love stuff like that looks at the real world with eyes of wonder. That's one of the things I tried to do in Brooklyn Dreams, was look at my years growing up crazy and dysfunctional in Brooklyn, but bring those eyes of wonder to reality. Because I think reality, one of the reasons why we like to write in fantasy, because I think fantasy is one of the best ways to express reality. Because reality is utterly fantastic. It just is. And, look at the world we're living in now. I was just talking to somebody about this. You couldn't write this stuff, what's happening in our country right now. If you did, it would seem too ridiculous. And yet here it is playing out. So the real world is just utterly fantastic. And I think that one of the best ways to approach reality is through tales that use fantasy. If I may plug something, I had a new novel that came out. It just happens to be here, called Dark Future. It's a time travel story. The time traveler is from the early 60s, and he travels into this dark dystopian future, which is our present day. So, it was a way to kind of take a step back from the world that we're living in now and realize that right now we're living in the middle of a Philip K. Dick science fiction story. Look at our politics. Look at the technology that's going on. Who thought even 3 years ago we'd be talking about AI the way we're talking about it now? Look at what's happening to the planet in terms of climate change. All these things. We are living smack dab in the middle of a science fiction novel right now. And this was my way of kind of working through. Some days it's really traumatic to wake up into this world right now because, I'm afraid to open my Google News page to see what the hell happened today, One of the great joys of being a writer is through story, we work this stuff out. We look for our solutions. We find our hope, because I'm a great believer in hope. We're human. We give into despair, but I think it's always important to turn to hope, to look for solutions, to believe that there is something bigger and better than the ugliness that the media is feeding us every day. Because I think we know in our day-to-day lives, just through the people that we know, that, if we just went by what they're telling us on TV, we would think that people are just the absolute worst. And I would say that most of the people that we know in our day-to-day lives are good and decent people. And it's really important to remember that at our core, I believe in the inherent decency that in the Superman and Captain America within all of us, So this story, Dark Future, was one of I didn't realize when I set out, but as I'm writing it, I realized, I'm grappling with all these things I grapple with when I wake up every day into the reality of our world right now. And that's one of the joys of writing fiction.
So a lot of your work is, like you said, about finding like hope in the darkness. And like, what are some things that you can follow along all of your characters, finding that hope in the darkness, that maybe from your own life or your own experiences that you kind of include in that moment? Because it's pivotal to people. I mean, Craven's Last Hunt is a really dark story, but it's also weirdly uplifting. Like this moment of Spider-Man crawling out of the grave
Yes.
is dark and almost horror-like, but also beautiful and like uplifting, because he pictures Mary Jane and his love for her is what brings him up.
Exactly.
Those are the moments from your work that stand out the most to me. Those moments of people finding hope in the darkness. So where does that come from for you?
That just comes from my own experience. Without going too far off the deep end here, I'm not religious, but I am spiritual. And I have had experiences in my life where I have seen the divinity that I believe that is inside every single one of us, even the people that seem to be just monstrous, awful people, somewhere in them, it's in all of us. And that's what gives me hope. Once I experience that, not just as a belief, but as a concrete reality, that there is something that unites us all, there's something bigger than all of us that we are part of. That's what gives me hope, and that's what keeps me going. So, like Peter Parker in the grave, you have to go through the darkness sometimes to get to the light. But I've seen the light, and that sounds, what a cliche. I've seen the light, but I have seen and experienced that light. And that's what gives me hope, because I believe that it's in you and you and you and all of us. And in some people, it's buried deep, and in other people, you can find it on the surface. And that's the great metaphor of some of these characters, like a Superman, because he represents, to me, that light in all of us. The part of us that is truly good and decent and wants the best for everyone and is moving individually, and we're moving as a culture toward that light, even though it seems like some days we're going off the cliff straight into the darkness. And again, writing those stories is a way for me to reaffirm that hope for myself, let alone to pass it on to people that are reading those stories. The writers that I treasure the most that I read are the ones that give me that. And it's just like, pass it on. Pass it on. And the next person may find something in my stories that may inspire them to pass it on through their own art.
Out of like the characters you've written, like which characters have taught you the most about yourself, like emotionally, spiritually, mentally, like, because you've written like plethora of characters with different depths, emotions, things going on. So which character or characters have taught you the most about yourself?
That's interesting, that have taught me about myself. I think every story that you write is going to teach you something about yourself, because first and foremost, I write for myself. And as I said before, you're not doing it consciously. You're just creating a story, but it's all coming out of your unconscious. So it all becomes therapy in a way. And sometimes you look back years later, you look at a story and go, oh my God, look at what I was working out. On Craven's Last Hunt, I was going through a very, very difficult time in my life at that point. And so I was working through a lot of stuff. At the time, if you would have asked me, are you working through your stuff through writing the story? I would have said, no, what are you talking about? I can look at it now and realize, yeah, I really, really was. I was Peter coming up from the grave, reaching for that light. And I was Craven, feeling like I was losing my mind. And part of me felt like vermin down in the sewers, I guess we teach each other. But Peter Parker is such a three-dimensional, real human being to me, I think he's one of the single most real, relatable, and I think any writer who's worked on Spider-Man would probably say the same thing. He's just so relatable and so real. And as I said before, we all put a part of ourselves into Peter, and yet Peter is an independent entity. So maybe we do, we bring a little bit of Peter into ourselves, and we give a little bit of ourselves to Peter. You really want that to happen with any character that you're writing. I'm always amazed at how much of myself I pour into these characters. You know, if you read Dark Future, the main character is from a different generation. He's from the World War II generation, different experiences than mine. And yet his journey as a writer, because the main character is a writer, his journey as a writer very much parallels mine. And I got to write a lot about my own journey and my own creative process through this character. I never thought about learning from the characters, but it's true. You know, we teach the characters and the characters teach us, and we become something bigger than what we are individually in some ways. And that's what's true of a great collaboration too. Working with Giffen, you know, Giffen had a certain set of skills. I had a certain set of skills, and you put us together and it became almost like a third entity, you know, that did things that neither one of us could do alone. You know, and that's the joy of creativity and collaboration.
Your run on like the Spectacular Spider-Man, like I feel like it's highlighted for its emotional depth and dealing with affliction. So like what interested you about Harry as a character?
You know what I really, really loved about that story, and I worked on that book for 2 years with Sal Buscema, who only passed away last year. Fantastic artist, incredible storyteller, and again, chemistry just happened between us, and we couldn't create it; it just happened. I was loved working with him. Amazing artist. But Harry and Peter, you know, Jerry Conway had done a story years before where Harry had become the Green Goblin and had a little mental breakdown. I don't think there's such thing as a little mental breakdown. And so I love this concept. You know, I like families. I like studying families and the effects of, you know, the interactions of parents and children and the effects that has on us and how it can lift us up or break us apart. And Harry had this traumatic childhood, really being raised by Norman. And then you look at all of Peter's childhood, and I was going through a lot of therapy at the time myself, so I was really into looking at what, you know, the first story arc was called The Child Within. What are the things that happen in our childhood that form us as adults that sometimes we don't even begin to grapple with until we're in our 20s and 30s? And so, you know, so I got to peel back Harry's head and peel back Peter's head, and we brought in the character of Vermin, Edward Whalen, and we got to understand what happened in his childhood and to throw all these things together. And then the best part of it was you had this relationship between Peter and Harry. They were best friends. These two guys loved each other. They were very best friends. And yet in the context of this story, they're enemies. So as a writer, you can't ask for a better setup for a drama than two best friends who both love and oppose each other. You know, the stories practically wrote themselves. And that story went on over the course of 2 years, right through Harry's death in Spectacular 200, which is probably my favorite single issue of Spider-Man that I've ever written. So yeah, there was so much meat there to explore. It was like the perfect story for me.
Yeah, I think that dynamic of like two best friends who become torn apart over a cause or something like that is like one of the most kind of, I don't know, when I think of like those story tropes, like I really find myself connecting with it. It's just like, it's always like such a heartbreaking thing. Like I remember like 3 years ago, there's this this Bollywood movie that made it to the Oscars called RRR.
Oh yeah, I
It's
saw it.
essentially that. Oh my God, fantastic movie. And it's exactly like that. It's just these two, I guess, bros. I mean, they're bros during the whole movie, and then they figure out that the other one is working for the other side. And so they have to clash. And it's just such an unfortunate kind of event because it's both bigger than themselves, but you know, all
But what's great about that kind of scenario with Peter and Harry too is that then you realize that, you know, it's so easy, especially in comics, heroes and villains, good guys and bad guys. In a story like that, there's no good guy and bad guy because you have compassion for both people in the situation they're in. And you know that at their core, they still care about each other. So you can't reduce somebody to the simple cliche of being a bad guy when you have a situation like that.
Exactly. I agree.
What do you feel made Harry such an effective mirror for Peter?
You know, just that, you know, I have a story actually coming up in Amazing Spider-Man 1000, which will be out in September, which is actually kind of a postscript to that whole run and explores what you're talking about because they're kind of mirrors of each other. You know, they both had traumas in their childhood. Peter lost his parents at a very young age. Then he lost Uncle Ben, and that was traumatic because he took on the responsibility of that. Harry lost his mother at an early age. He grew up with this abusive father. And the mirror is, you never know how sometimes two people in the same family, if they're going through an abusive situation, will come out completely different. They survive that situation. They find different survival tools, and one of them might come through it. The other one might be completely broken by it. And that was one of the interesting things to explore. So both Peter and Harry are coming from this traumatic past, and you look at who Peter was and who Harry was, and why did it break Harry and it didn't break Peter? And then you begin to peel that back and explore that, and it's kind of fascinating.
I feel like it explores a lot, like with like Harry struggles with insecurity, addiction, like just like a lot going on with him, especially like him as a character. Like obviously you have like, like his father and the sins of his father sometimes fall upon the children, and just like a lot like that weighs upon like somebody. And just like also like having Harry serve as a foil to Peter, and just seeing that within the character and within their friendship as well. So I feel like that was captured really well, and I feel like your story like highlighting that, like just typical human things, but like building like higher stakes for them. Like, okay, this is a friendship, but not only just regular friendship like Spider-Man and like the Son of the Green
Right.
Goblin.
Well, that's the
and Son
fun
the
of comics,
Wizard.
right? Because we get to take these very real issues and you blow them up on this big screen with all these costumes and masks. And in a way you get to explore them almost more deeply by doing it, by blowing them up in that way. Making them larger than life gives you more room to get in there and explore it. Comics are a great vehicle for that.
Definitely. I mean, I think each artistic medium carries its own kind of both limitations and advantages. Like, I think limitations force creativity, but through those limitations, it becomes an advantage, I would say. If you take just like a novel and try to turn it into a movie, 9 times out of 10, most people like to say that the novel is better than the movie.
I'm a fan of the Spider-Man, the animated series, the 90s, and especially doing Spider-Man 94. So what made you want to write it, and like, how does it feel to return back to the character after that long time of resuming his story?
Yeah, it's sometimes it's not, people say, well, what made you want to write that? Because the editor called me up and said, hey, we're going to do this. Would you like to do it? And, I like working with the editor, and I love Spider-Man, But then, of course, once you say yes, then you have to dig deep, I'd worked on one episode of the show years and years ago, but I really had to do a deep dive. I'm always looking for, I'm on the treadmill every day, so I'm always looking for something to watch. So I had like 2 weeks of just watching those Spider-Man cartoons to really dive deep. And the challenge of doing that series was you wanted to move it forward from where they left off, and you wanted to treat it as if these were episodes of the show, meaning you're not in the regular Marvel universe, you are in the universe of the animated show. But you're also writing a comic book, and there's certain ways you tell a story in a comic book that are different than telling a story in an animated show. You want the voice of the show, you want the feeling of the show, but you want to be able to bring in the certain kind of energy and storytelling skills that you have in a comic book. So I tried to balance those things. If I brought in a character like Morlun or Kane, I'd never written Morlun before, but I've written a lot of Kane in the regular Spider books. But once you enter the Spider universe, you get to recreate those characters. Kraven was in there. Well, the Kraven in the animated series, very different than Kraven in the comics. So it gave me the freedom to reinvent these characters as if they were appearing in an episode of the TV show for the first time. So that was really fun. It was really fun. And I have no official word, but I do hope, whether I'm involved or not, I hope they do more. In fact, I'd love to see John Semper, who was the guiding light behind the animated series, get involved and do some of the comics as well.
What's your favorite Spider-Man animated show, since you've watched so many on the treadmill? And why is it Spectacular Spider-Man?
That was going to be my answer. Yeah, but and then again, talk about adaptation.
Is there another answer?
Look, if you look at that, it's not exactly the same as the comics. They change a lot of stuff, but the essence of what Spider-Man is about is all there in that show. Is all there in that show.
Yeah.
But give credit to John Semper in the '90s show, because a whole generation of fans came along and learned about Spider-Man through that show. And they created a whole universe. There would be no Spider-Verse if it wasn't for that. They did that story on that show originally, and that's where that jumped off from. So all credit to John Semper for the great work he did on that show as well. But yeah, Spectacular Spider-Man was a great show.
Yeah, I mean, fantastic piece of television. I'm so sad they ended it where they did.
Yeah, well, you never know. I keep hoping also that maybe because of the comic book that maybe they will, just the way they resurrected X-Men 97, that they'll resurrect the Spider-Man show and do more of those. That would be great.
Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. I think the license is too messed up because of Sony and
Yeah, you never know. You never know.
but hopefully, I'm begging, please.
Yeah, no, definitely. I love the 90s show. I love that. And it's really great. I hope they bring that back as well, you know?
I was gonna ask, how excited are you for the next Spider-Verse movie out of 10?
Oh, I really, again, there's another example of that too, because I was not well versed in those Spider-Verse stories. I wasn't well versed in Miles Morales, and I went in and I saw that movie and it completely captured me. And that's the essence. It's a movie. It's not the comic. I don't have you don't want to have read the you don't need to have read the comic to enjoy the movie. Or I remember seeing the first Iron Man movie and thinking, I like this better than the comics. This is like, I understand Iron Man in a way that I never did before. One of my favorite of the X-Men movies is First Class, where they did all the origins and stuff. Great story,
That's
really
smart.
great story. And I thought, wow, this is like such a clarification, because the X-Men universe, they've built and built and built, so it's so top heavy. There's so much complication. And X-Men First Class kind of laid out the entire X-Men mythos in a way that was really emotionally engaging. And, a lot of these movies, you get to the third act and it's just people beating the shit out of each other, and it's kind of lost the thread, And what I loved about, say, X-Men First Class was that final battle at the end with Magneto. I said Magneto, not Magneto. I know everyone says Magneto. It was all about character. It was all about his turn in character. So the outer, and you hope that with a great superhero story, that the outer action is a reflection of something that's going on inside the character psychologically and emotionally. And that's what I loved about that movie. I don't know how I got onto that, but there you go.
Speaking of movies, what is your thought on and expectations for Brand New Day?
I hate to have expectations for these movies. I really do. It's sort of like,
I think that's a great perspective to have.
They they put out like the trailer for the trailer, the 30-second trailer before the trailer, and people are arguing on the internet, oh, this movie's going to sell, this is blah. You have no idea what this movie's going to be until you sit in the theater and you see it. You hope, and sometimes you have these great expectations and you're let down, and sometimes you see the trailer and go, oh, this is going to suck. And you sit down and I remember one of my favorite superhero movies is the first Captain America movie. And I just thought, it's World War II. How are you going to do this without it being absolutely ridiculous? And this costume and the flag waving and all this stuff. And this is coming from a guy who loves Captain America. And my wife said, I'm going to go see it without you. And she went to see it. She came back. She said, you are going to love this movie. And I went to see it. And I did. They did such a beautiful, and I've seen that movie a bunch of times since. I just love it. It's very pure. And the casting is so perfect. So you never know. So I try not to pass judgment on these things before I put my butt in the seat and watch the movie.
So as we bring this to a close, is there any final thoughts, any upcoming projects, writing seminars?
Yeah, I had a bunch of I had so many things coming up that I actually had to write them down so I wouldn't forget. So let me open this up. Okay, Dark Future I mentioned. The second season of Cape Crusader comes out July 31st. You'll see my episode there. Coming out in July is the 50th anniversary of Rocket Raccoon. I've got a story in there with my buddy Sean McManus. Same month, there's Mary Jane 50th anniversary celebration. I've got a story in there. Then Amazing Spider-Man 1000 comes out in September. I've got a story in there. There's something else. Negative Burn is an anthology that Joe Pruitt used to do years ago, and he did a Kickstarter. And he's reviving this anthology, of which I've got a story in there. I have at Dark Horse, if you're familiar with the Minor Threats universe that Patton Oswalt and Jordan Blum have it over at Dark Horse, they've created a whole universe of their own characters, and they've invited a lot of different creators to come in and tell stories. So Kevin McGuire, our artist from JLI, Kevin McGuire and I are doing a one-shot special. We've created a whole bunch of new characters, a new superhero team in the JLI tradition, kind of, for the Minor Threats universe, and that should be out, I think, at the end of the year. A lot of projects coming up.
A lot of things to look forward to, eh?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's really been fun to talk to you guys. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah.